In this section, we'll guide you step by step through the process of buffing stainless steel. You'll learn how to prepare the piece for buffing using simple hand tools and the Eastwood expander wheel. Most important, you'll see the whole buffing process from beginning to end. You'll learn how to let your tools do the work so you can get the most professional results possible with the least amount of effort. We'll also point out the most common mistakes people make and tell you how to avoid them. As shown previously, work slightly below the center line of the wheel in this area of the wheel. You don't need to exert a lot of pressure on the wheel. About 2 pounds of pressure is enough. That's about the same amount of force you would use to close a properly working file drawer. Let the wheel do the work for you. Buff towards sharp edges so the wheel runs off the workpiece over the edge. If you are buffing an irregularly shaped piece, be very alert. The wheel can catch a surface you're not working on and rip the piece from your hand. It's important to choose the right equipment, such as a motor with the proper revolutions per minute for the job you want to do. If your motor is underpowered, you won't be able to maintain the RPM you need to do a good job. If your motor has the correct power rating but turns too fast, too much heat will be generated and the piece you're working on will be discolored. For buffing stainless steel, we recommend our ball door motor, which runs at 3,450 RPM. The size of the buffing wheel you use depends on the size of the motor. Use this motor wheel specification chart to determine the correct size wheel to use with your motor. You'll want to allow yourself enough working room and make sure the buffing wheel is far enough from the motor housing so you can make a pass without running into it or the workbench. If needed, use the Eastwood motor adapters to give yourself extra working room. They come in different shaft sizes to adapt to your motor and to the buffing wheels. If you need more room to work with a larger part, you can use our pedestal-type motor mount. Next, you'll need to choose the right wheel and the correct compound for the job you want to do. This buffing wheel and compound selection chart comes with your Eastwood buffing supplies. It shows you exactly which combination of Eastwood wheels and compounds you need to use for each step of the buffing process. You'll want to follow it carefully, and as before, the wheel and compound you use for each step depend on the type of metal you're buffing. In general, you work in order from most coarse to least coarse. You must use the correct combination of steps to get the proper results. Before you begin buffing, you need to be sure the piece is properly prepared. There should be no major dents or scratches. The surface of the piece should be regular and as close to the original shape as possible. If a scratch is deep enough to be detected by running your fingernails across the piece, buffing alone won't remove it. You'll need to file or sand the area to remove the scratch. If the piece is dented, you can reshape it in a number of ways. One way is to use a trim hammer with a dolly or backplate to work out the dents. Then use a file and sandpaper to eliminate major scratches. Small pieces may be held in your hand. However, for larger pieces, we suggest the panel beater sandbag. Here are the steps you need to follow. Starting at the outside of the dent, work gradually in a circular pattern toward the center. Tap lightly with the hammer against the dolly. This may require many light taps, but the more care you take at this stage, the easier the rest of the project will be. It's a good idea to practice this technique on a scrap piece before trying it on the piece you want to restore. After you have tapped out the dent, use a fine file to remove any high spots. Be careful not to remove too much metal. Inspect your piece for a smooth, even surface. If necessary, use the trim hammer again to bring up any low points. When you're satisfied with the surface of the piece, use 220 grit sandpaper to remove any file marks. When you're sanding, use a wooden or rubber sanding block to ensure an even finish. Using your fingers for backing may create surface irregularities. Keep in mind that stainless steel may require more sanding than aluminum and other softer metals. Next, go over the area again with 320 grit sandpaper to remove any scratches left by the 220 grit. Finally, finish sanding the area with 400 grit sandpaper to remove all previous sanding marks. Once again, as we stated earlier, you can make the job of filing and sanding easier by using the Eastwood expander wheel. It does both jobs in one step and can be used on both stainless steel and aluminum. Start with the 120 or 220 grit, depending on the surface of the piece, and remove the small bumps and pimples made during dent removal. Work the piece below the center of the wheel. Keep the piece moving while it's in contact with the wheel. This will avoid creating ridges. After sanding in one direction and making the surface uniform, stop the wheel and change to the next finer grit. When you change from one grit to the next, be sure to turn the piece 90 degrees so you are working at a right angle to the previous pattern. This eliminates scratch marks. When the coarser grit lines disappear, change belts again. It's not necessary to use a finer grit than 400 because the Eastwood buffs and compounds will buff out a 400 grit finish. As before, we suggest using a second-hand motor, such as an old washing machine motor. When you've completed the fourth level using the 400 grit, you're ready to begin buffing. First, consult the buffing wheel and compound selection chart. There are 3 steps required for buffing stainless steel. Begin with a sisal wheel and emery compound. This first step removes fine scratches and leaves a uniform finish. Check to be sure the buffing wheel is mounted firmly on the spindle, between the flange and washers. For both safety reasons and ease of use, check to be sure the wheel is spinning smoothly, with the top of the wheel coming towards you. If the wheel is not operating properly, turn off the motor and make the necessary adjustments. Apply the emery compound to the wheel. While the wheel is running, pass the tube of compound lightly across the wheel face, slightly below the spindle axis, until the face of the wheel is lightly coated. It's normal for the compound to appear dried out. The heat from the wheel will melt the binder and allow the compound to be picked up by the wheel. A mistake beginners often make is applying too much compound. More compound doesn't mean the part will buff faster. In fact, excessive compound causes black streaks, which are difficult to remove. You'll need to reload the wheel from time to time. Do this with a wiping motion across the face of the wheel. You'll also need to occasionally clean the wheel with a buff rake to get rid of particle buildup and dried compound. Exerting a little additional pressure on the wheel will also get rid of high spots and recondition the face of the wheel. One important caution: never mix compounds on a wheel. Once compounds are mixed, the wheel becomes contaminated and it's ruined. Work the piece horizontally across the face of the buff. Use light pressure and slow passes. The longer the stroke, the better. Inspect your work frequently and remember to reapply compound as necessary. As you gain experience, you'll develop a technique that works best for you. Practice is the key. If the piece you're working on starts to bounce against the wheel, something is wrong. Either the wheel isn't properly mounted and dressed, or you're applying too much pressure. Remember, let the wheel do the work. After you've buffed the entire piece with the sisal wheel and emery compound, you're ready for step 2. It's important to let the piece cool and to wipe it with a clean rag between each step. If any amount of a coarser compound is left on the piece, it will contaminate the next wheel and scratch the piece. In step 2, you'll change to a spiral sewed wheel and the stainless compound. This step has limited cutting ability and leaves a bright finish. Turn your piece 90 degrees so you're working across any scratches left by the emery compound. You can inspect your progress by checking the reflection on the surface of the piece. If the reflection is irregular as you move the part, the surface is uneven and won't buff out. Keep the surface smooth and even. Remember to let the piece cool and to wipe it off between each stage. Now you're ready for the final stage in buffing stainless steel. Change to the loose section wheel and apply the white rouge compound. This stage has no cutting ability. It brings out the true color or luster of the metal. A word of advice: stainless steel has a tendency to burn or discolor if it is heated too rapidly. To avoid this, don't work in any one area too long, and always allow the piece to cool before going from one stage to the next. This will eliminate a lot of problems. You've now completed the 3 stages of buffing stainless steel. Your piece will be returned to its original luster. After you've finished buffing the piece, we suggest you protect it with semi-chrome polish. This will help keep the finish bright.